They called her the godmother, but this was no movie. This was real blood on real streets. And before Pablo Escobar rose to global infamy, a woman from the slums of Colombia was already building an empire so dangerous, even the most ruthless men whispered her name with fear. She didn't ask for respect. She took it. Her story doesn't begin in a penthouse, but in a place where the sound of gunfire was more familiar than a lullaby. And somehow, from those dark alleys, she clawed her way up, not just into the drug trade, but to the very top. This is the untold origin of Griselda Blanco. Not just a queenpin, but the mother of an empire soaked in cash and corpses. It began in the searing heat of Cartagena, Colombia. In 1943, the waves of the Caribbean danced against the shore, oblivious to the child born into a country on the brink of bloodshed. Her name was Griselda Blanco Restrepo, but no one knew yet what terror she would grow into. Griselda's earliest memories weren't of toys or birthday parties, they were of bodies. Colombia was ablaze in a civil war known as La Violencia, triggered by the assassination of a political leader. Over 200,000 people would be slaughtered in the chaos. And Griselda? She was watching, learning. Survival wasn't a skill, it was law. At just 3 years old, her mother Ana took her to Medellin, hoping to escape the unrest. But safety was a myth. Medellin was broken, flooded with crime, ruled by corruption. Griselda didn't find refuge, she found war in a new form. By 11, she had already committed her first kidnapping. Not out of revenge, not for some righteous cause, but to prove she could. She snatched a child from a wealthy neighborhood and held him for ransom. And when the child cried, she didn't flinch. Her heart, even then, was stone. By her teens, crime was her comfort. Pickpocketing, scheming, street deals, Medellin's alleyways were her classroom. But nothing prepared her for the betrayal that drove her into the shadows for good. At 19, after years of enduring sexual abuse from her mother's boyfriend, she ran. Bruised, hungry, and hardened, she slept in the streets, surviving by stealing what she needed and stabbing whoever got in her way. What no one saw coming was how fast she'd rise. By the early 1960s, she had a partner in both life and crime, Carlos Trujillo. Together, they launched a small-time marijuana business, distributing in the dark alleys of Medellin. It was modest but profitable, and yet money wasn't enough. Not for Griselda. Their marriage turned bitter, poisoned by suspicion and secrets. Some say Carlos got too loud, others say he got greedy. But one day he vanished. Rumor has it Griselda made the call that ended his life. No tears, no regrets. Just one more obstacle cleared. And so, draped in black, she didn't mourn. She evolved. In 1964, Griselda crossed into the United States under false documents. She was illegal. She was dangerous. And she was determined. With 3 sons at her side and a new man on her arm, Alberto Bravo, a high-level cocaine trafficker tied to the Medellin cartel, Griselda arrived in Queens, New York, ready to build something monstrous. Alberto had connections. Griselda had vision. In a time when most traffickers were still fumbling with cannabis, Griselda saw the future, and it was cocaine. As demand exploded across American cities in the 1970s, she and Alberto orchestrated one of the most intricate drug smuggling operations ever seen, funneling pure Colombian cocaine into Miami, New York, and Los Angeles with terrifying precision. Griselda didn't just move product, she moved the market. She became the blueprint. using lingerie models, secret compartments in furniture, and even children as unsuspecting couriers. She carved out an empire that delivered over 3 tons of cocaine into the U.S. each year. At her peak, she was pulling in an estimated $80 million per month. But the real secret behind her dominance wasn't creativity, it was brutality. Those who stole from her, dead. Those who crossed her, dead. Even those who loved her husbands, lovers, friends, if they stood in her way, they were expendable. Alberto Bravo would soon learn that. By the mid-70s, tensions between them boiled over. Greed, power, paranoia. No one knows exactly what happened, but one night in Bogota, their argument turned into gunfire. Griselda walked away. Alberto didn't. She didn't just kill her second husband. She became legend for it. The streets began to whisper her name, La Madrina, the godmother. From that moment forward, Griselda Blanco wasn't just a player. She was a monarch, and everyone else? Just pawns in her bloody chess game. She took full control of the operation, expanding into California and Florida. Cocaine wasn't a backroom deal anymore. It was a business empire run like a corporation, but built on murder. As the Medellin cartel grew in power, so did its enemies. And in Miami, Griselda sparked a war that would redefine the city itself. The cocaine cowboy era wasn't built by cowboys. It was ignited by a queen. Her strategy? Mass violence. She ordered hits like she ordered dinner. Clean, quick, brutal. She was the first to popularize motorcycle assassinations, killers riding up beside their targets in traffic and opening fire before speeding away into the night. The streets of Miami ran red, and Griselda's name ran through every blood trail. By 1979, her legend was so large it couldn't hide. That summer, 2 of her men gunned down a rival dealer and his bodyguard inside a crowded liquor store in broad daylight. That murder turned heads and marked the start of the Miami drug war. Civilians ducked bullets in shopping malls. Families drove past shootouts on their way to church. And behind it all, the Black Widow watched from her ivory tower, unmoved. Even her own family wasn't safe. One of her many hits was meant for a man named Jesus Castro, who allegedly harmed one of her sons. But the gunman missed and killed Castro's 2-year-old instead. When her assassin called in shame, Griselda reportedly told him not to worry. "Now it's even," she said. The woman had no lines she wouldn't cross. Not even with Escobar. Pablo Escobar may have become the most famous drug lord on earth, but insiders say he feared one person more than anyone else: Griselda Blanco. She was older, more ruthless, and less predictable than anyone in the game. Where Pablo built alliances, Griselda left body bags. And for years she kept her empire alive in a world that wasn't made for women, especially not violent, dominant ones. But as her reach grew, so did her enemies. Rival factions like the Ochoa brothers began circling her territory. Power struggles erupted, trust evaporated. The empire that had once seemed untouchable began to crack. Still, she pressed on blind to the tightening noose around her neck. By the early 1980s, she was the undisputed queen of Miami's underworld. Her enemies were either buried or hiding. The DEA knew who she was, but couldn't catch her. The Medellin cartel respected her, but hated her. And she didn't care. She never did. But her reign wasn't eternal. And the next chapter of her story, well, it begins with a knock on the door an ambush, and the betrayal of a trusted ally. Because no matter how high you rise in the drug game, there's always someone waiting in the shadows, ready to pull the trigger. Now it came when she least expected it. After years of dodging the law like a ghost, Griselda Blanco thought she was untouchable. She had slipped through the cracks of international investigations, crossed borders under fake names, and buried every witness brave enough to speak her name. But in 1985, the walls finally closed in. She was living in style an opulent home in Irvine, California. The kind of house with marble floors, gold fixtures, and velvet drapes so thick they muffled the world. But none of that mattered when the D broke through the front door. No warning. No last drink, no last deal. Just handcuffs. The woman who once moved $80 million in cocaine every month, who gave orders that ended dozens of lives, who stared down cartel kings like Escobar without blinking, was led away in silence. Her arrest had been years in the making. The D had built the case piece by piece, using flipped smugglers turned assassins and secret recordings. She was charged with drug trafficking, racketeering, conspiracy to murder. The charges stretched back to the 70s, but finally, justice had caught up. In New York, where some of her earliest operations took root, she stood trial. For the first time, America saw the face behind the myth, the godmother of cocaine. The woman who once made a liquor store massacre look like just another Tuesday. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but if the world thought a jail cell would break her, they didn't know Griselda Blanco. From behind bars, she was still feared. Rumors swirled that she was running operations from prison phones, that her soldiers on the outside still followed her commands, that death orders were still coming in from cell block C, and yet the empire she built was starting to rot. Enemies had multiplied, her sons were being hunted, and the very violence that had fueled her success was now threatening to swallow her whole. By the late 80s, prosecutors weren't done with her. They had new evidence, new witnesses, and a new plan to end her story with a needle. That's right, the death penalty. Griselda faced fresh indictments in Florida, this time for murder. Over 200 killings were linked to her, but the government only needed to prove a few, just enough to make the case airtight, just enough to make it fatal. They had their star witness, Jorge Rivi Ayala, one of her most feared hitmen. He didn't just kill for her, he admired her. And yet, in the face of a life sentence, Ayala flipped. He testified that Griselda had ordered cold-blooded killings, including the assassination of a former associate, and accidentally his 2-year-old son. Ayala claimed she wasn't even remorseful. She was satisfied. Now it's even, she had said. 2 words that echoed like a curse. The courtroom held its breath. But just when it seemed the prosecution had her cornered, scandal struck. Ayala had been flirting with the prosecution's secretary's phone calls and inappropriate remarks. Suddenly, their star witness was compromised. The credibility of the case cracked wide open, and the death penalty slipped off the table like a missed shot in the dark. Instead of execution, Griselda Blanco took a plea deal, 3 counts of second-degree murder, 20 years. Even then, she didn't serve all of it. In 2004, she was released early due to health issues, and the country that had once feared her now watched her vanish deported quietly back to Colombia, the place where it had all begun. You'd think this would be the end, that the Black Widow would fade into the shadows. But Griselda Blanco's story doesn't end with prison walls. It ends with poetic irony. In the quiet streets of Medellin, Griselda was living in near obscurity. No more empire, no more blood trails, just silence. She had tried to keep a low profile. No flashy homes, no armed guards. But karma doesn't forget. On the afternoon of September 3rd, 2012, she stepped out of a butcher shop with her pregnant daughter-in-law by her side. It was supposed to be a normal errand, but death was waiting. A motorcycle pulled up beside her, just like she had once ordered dozens of times. 2 shots, close range, chest and shoulder. She collapsed in a pool of her own blood. Her assassin didn't even glance back. It was a scene ripped straight from her own playbook. She died on the spot. Age 69. Cause: the very method she made infamous. The world watched in shock. The woman who brought violence to the streets of Miami, who sparked wars and outlived 3 husbands, was finally gone. And her final breath was stolen the same way she had taken so many. But even in death, she was a spectacle. 2 days later, her body was laid in a gold-trimmed casket and buried in Jardin's Monte Sacro Cemetery next to Pablo Escobar, the queen and the king of Colombian crime, now sharing dirt. And that wasn't the only twist. Buses arrived at the funeral not filled with cartel soldiers or armed guards, but with children. Poor kids from Antioquia, where Griselda once handed out toys every Christmas, where, even as she built her empire with blood, she played godmother in more ways than one. They cried. They thanked her. Because in their world, Griselda Blanco wasn't just a criminal. She was a myth, a provider, a symbol of power. But power, in the end, has a price, and hers had finally come due. Her legacy, though, wouldn't die with her. She left behind more than just a trail of bodies. She left behind a family. Her most famous son, Michael Corleone Blanco, named after the Godfather character, grew up watching his mother rule the streets. He saw the guns, the blood, the betrayal, but he also saw the loyalty, the strength, the fearlessness. After her death, Michael tried to carve out a different life. He launched a lifestyle brand called Pur a Blanco, an empire built not on cocaine, but on legacy. On interviews, he admits, "She did bad things, I know that, but she was my mother, and I loved her." Today, he runs a multi-million-dollar business, cashing in on a name that still echoes in the underworld. But he also walks with the ghosts she left behind. Because when your mother is the most feared woman in drug history, you don't escape the shadow. You learn how to live in it. They buried her body, but they never buried her legend. The news of her death exploded like dynamite across the globe. Griselda Blanco, the Black Widow, La Madrina, the cocaine godmother executed on the same kind of motorcycle hit she once made famous. It was karmic. It was cinematic. It was savage. And yet, it still wasn't the most shocking part of her story, because even in death, Griselda's grip tightened. She had been gone barely a week when the vultures began to circle, not just journalists and authors, but Hollywood producers, rap moguls, politicians. Everyone wanted a piece of her. Everyone wanted to retell the nightmare, but no one could truly contain it. You see, Griselda Blanco didn't just run drugs. She ran narratives. She transformed from a street criminal into a mythological force. The cocaine game had kings, but she was the first queen. A billionaire who built her throne from bullet casings and bodies and sat on it like it was a church pew. Her story became religion in the underworld. Even Netflix came calling. Their limited series Griselda, starring Sofia Vergara, became a global sensation. Viewers watched in disbelief as this stylish, calculating woman outmaneuvered, outshot, and outlived nearly every man who dared stand next to her. And for once, Hollywood didn't exaggerate, because real life had already done that. From Cocaine Cowboys documentaries to rap verses by Lil' Kim, Nicki Minaj, and even Kanye Griselda's name echoed in clubs, courtrooms, and corner blocks. Her legacy had leapt from narcotics to pop culture, from handcuffs to headphones. She became a symbol of danger, of power, of rebellion. But underneath the glamorized chaos was something colder, more chilling. No one ever counted all her victims. No one ever dared. Authorities linked her to over 200 murders. That's not a statistic. That's a graveyard. Entire family lines were ended on her orders. Children died. Friends betrayed each other. Cities bled. And in every one of those stories, her fingerprints. And she didn't blink. Not once. This was a woman who, when told her hitman had accidentally murdered a child instead of the father, reportedly smiled and said, "That'll do." What kind of person says that? What kind of soul sleeps at night after orchestrating a massacre? What kind of mother names her son Michael Corleone and raises him inside a living Godfather script? One answer: a woman possessed by power. Griselda Blanco shattered every mold. She bulldozed gender expectations. She didn't just enter a male-dominated world, she turned it on its head and made it beg. Men who wouldn't hesitate to kill froze when her name was mentioned. The agents admitted they feared her more than Pablo, because Pablo had rules. Griselda? None. She used children as drug mules. She used churches as stash houses. She once smuggled cocaine inside human corpses. Let that sink in. She paid off judges, manipulated the legal system, and evaded the death penalty. When most kingpins were dying in shootouts, she walked out of prison in designer shoes and disappeared into Medellin like a ghost returning to her crypt. And somehow, that still wasn't the scariest part. The scariest part is this: she won. Griselda Blanco lived the full arc of a drug lord's dream. She climbed from dirt poverty to billionaire status, controlled cities, survived 3 husbands, outlived every major cartel rival from her era. She retired from crime, died free, and became more famous dead than alive. She wasn't just the Queenpin. She was the prototype. Even Michael Corleone Blanco, her last surviving son, admits that her story is too powerful to run from. That's why he capitalized on the Blanco brand, launching Por Blanco, a fashion and lifestyle empire rooted in narcotic nostalgia. The merchandise sells out, the brand thrives, and just like that, her legacy is no longer underground. It's on t-shirts, it's on Netflix, it's in club anthems, it's in your playlist, in your living room, on your timeline. Griselda Blanco is everywhere. She is what happens when the system fails a little girl in Colombia ... and she decides to burn the world instead of begging for help. She is what happens when power meets trauma and chooses to weaponize it. She is the face of ambition without limits. But here's the part that no one wants to say out loud: she's not gone. Because there are women in Medellin right now who worship her. Girls who whisper her name like a prayer. Dealers who study her moves like scripture. And every time someone downloads that documentary, raps that verse, wears that T-shirt, ... her ghost grows louder. This wasn't just a story about cocaine. This was about how a woman became fear itself. And in the end, she died not because of justice, not because of redemption. She died because someone else finally played her game better than she did. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. The blood had already dried, and the godmother had already won.